The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Charleston Historical Society archives on a gray October afternoon in 2024. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 42-year-old historian specializing in antebellum photography, sat hunched over a mahogany desk in the climate-controlled basement, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she carefully examined a collection of daguerreotypes recently donated by the estate of a prominent South Carolina family. The air smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, a scent she had grown to associate with uncovering hidden truths. Sarah had dedicated the last 15 years of her career to documenting the visual history of slavery in the American South, a task that had earned her both acclaim and criticism from various corners of academia and the public sphere. Her latest project focused on plantation photography from the 1850s, a period when the daguerreotype process had become accessible enough for wealthy plantation owners to commission formal portraits of their properties and families. These images, she believed, contained layers of meaning that contemporary viewers had overlooked, details that revealed the brutal reality beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. The collection before her contained 23 photographs, most showing the typical scenes one would expect. White families posed stiffly in their finest clothes, grand plantation houses with columned facades, and carefully arranged tableaus designed to project wealth and status. Sarah had seen hundreds of such images in her career, each one a carefully constructed lie about the nature of the plantation system. As she methodically cataloged each photograph, noting details about composition, lighting, and subject matter, Sarah came across an image that made her pause. The photograph, labeled simply as Oakwood Plantation, Mississippi, 1852, showed a sprawling estate house with white columns and a wide veranda. In the foreground stood the Whitmore family, patriarch Jonathan Whitmore, his wife Elizabeth, and their 3 children, all dressed in formal attire appropriate for the period. The family stood rigid and solemn, as was necessary given the long exposure times required for daguerreotype photography. At first glance, the image appeared unremarkable, another example of the self-aggrandizing portraiture that wealthy Southerners commissioned to document their supposed prosperity and refinement. But something about the photograph nagged at Sarah's trained eye, a sense that she was missing something crucial hidden within the frame. She reached for her magnifying loupe, a high-quality German-made instrument she had purchased during a research trip to Berlin, and began examining the image more closely. The details of the Whitmore family came into sharper focus. The elaborate lace on Elizabeth's dress, the watch chain across Jonathan's vest, the uncomfortable expressions on the children's faces as they struggled to remain still for the required exposure time. But as Sarah moved her examination toward the edges of the frame, beyond the carefully composed central subjects, she noticed something that made her heart race. In the background of the photograph, partially obscured by the shadow of the plantation house, stood a group of enslaved people. This in itself was not unusual. Plantation photographers often included enslaved workers in the background of estate photographs, positioned to suggest prosperity and productivity while carefully maintaining their status as property rather than people. What caught Sarah's attention was the arrangement and positioning of these background figures. Unlike most plantation photographs where enslaved people were posed in subservient positions or shown engaged in labor, the individuals in this image appeared to be positioned in a deliberate pattern. Sarah counted 14 people, all African American, standing in what initially seemed like a random grouping near the edge of the property. But as she studied their positions more carefully, moving her loupe slowly across the aged daguerreotype surface, she began to notice peculiarities. Several of the figures had their hands positioned in unusual ways, not the casual stance of people told to simply stand in the background, but deliberate gestures that seemed to carry meaning. One man stood with his left arm bent at a precise angle, his hand resting against his hip in a posture that seemed too formal, too intentional. A woman near him held her right hand at shoulder height, fingers spread in what appeared to be a specific configuration. 2 children stood in the far corner, their small bodies positioned in a way that drew Sarah's eye despite their distance from the camera. The historian sat back in her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. She had studied enough about resistance and communication among enslaved people to know that they had developed sophisticated systems of covert signaling, ways to convey information under the watchful eyes of their oppressors. Could this photograph contain evidence of such communication? Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, 4:30 in the afternoon. The archives would close in an hour, but she knew she would not be able to leave this mystery unsolved. She carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve and carried it to the high-resolution scanner in the adjacent room, a piece of equipment the Historical Society had acquired through a grant specifically for digitizing their fragile collection. The scanning process took nearly 20 minutes, as Sarah adjusted the settings to capture every possible detail from the original daguerreotype. When the digital file appeared on her computer screen, she immediately began enhancing the image, adjusting contrast and brightness to bring out details that were barely visible to the naked eye. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The positioning of the enslaved people in the background was not random at all. When she traced lines between their positions, a pattern emerged, a deliberate arrangement that could not have been accidental. Moreover, the gestures and hand positions she had noticed earlier became even more apparent in the enhanced digital image. Several individuals were making signs that Sarah recognized from her research on Underground Railroad communication methods. Sarah spent the next 3 hours in the archives, long past closing time, her presence authorized by her status as a senior researcher and her reputation for careful, important work. She cross-referenced the image with her extensive database of plantation photographs, looking for similar patterns or arrangements. She found nothing comparable. Most plantation photographs showed enslaved people as passive background elements, deliberately dehumanized and positioned to emphasize their status as property. But in this image from Oakwood Plantation, something different had occurred. The enslaved people had found a way to insert their own message into a photograph meant to celebrate their oppression, to hide in plain sight a communication that the photographer and the Whitmore family had either not noticed or had chosen to ignore. As Sarah worked, her mind filled with questions. What were they trying to communicate? Who was the intended audience? How had they coordinated this arrangement without detection? And most importantly, what had happened to these 14 people after this photograph was taken? The image was dated 1852, a pivotal year in the march toward the Civil War, a time when tensions over slavery were reaching a breaking point and the Underground Railroad was at the height of its operations. Sarah knew that Mississippi in 1852 was a dangerous place for enslaved people who showed any sign of resistance or independent thought. The punishments for attempted escape or perceived insubordination were brutal and often fatal. Yet these 14 people had taken the risk of embedding their message in this photograph, knowing that discovery could mean death. By the time Sarah finally left the archives that night, rain still falling steadily on the Charleston streets, she had made several important decisions. First, she would conduct a comprehensive investigation into the history of Oakwood Plantation and the Whitmore family. Second, she would attempt to identify the 14 enslaved people in the photograph and trace their fates. Third, she would analyze the specific positions and gestures captured in the image to determine if they corresponded to known communication systems used by enslaved people. And finally, she would document everything she found, ensuring that whatever message these people had risked their lives to send would finally be received and understood, 172 years after the photograph was taken. As she drove home through the wet streets, Sarah could not shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something significant, a story that would challenge accepted narratives about slavery and resistance, a story that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century and a half. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her office at the University of Charleston before sunrise, her mind still consumed by the mysterious photograph. She had barely slept, her thoughts circling around the implications of what she had discovered. If her interpretation was correct, this single daguerreotype represented a remarkable act of resistance, a message from enslaved people that had survived decades of deliberate historical erasure. Sarah's office was a cluttered space on the third floor of the history department, its walls lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves overflowing with research materials. Her desk was perpetually covered with photographs, documents, and open books, organized in a system that made sense only to her. She made a pot of strong coffee and settled into her worn leather desk chair, preparing for what she knew would be days or possibly weeks of intensive research. Her first task was to investigate the history of Oakwood Plantation and the Whitmore family. She began with the digital archives of Mississippi historical records, searching for property records, census data, and any contemporary accounts that might mention the plantation. The search results revealed that Oakwood Plantation had been established in 1827 by Jonathan Whitmore Sr., the father of the Jonathan Whitmore pictured in the photograph. The plantation had consisted of nearly 3,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land in the Mississippi Delta, worked by an enslaved population that varied between 150 and 200 people depending on the year and the whims of the cotton market. As Sarah dug deeper into the records, she began to piece together a picture of the Whitmore family and their operation. Jonathan Whitmore Jr., the man standing prominently in the center of the photograph, had inherited the plantation in 1848 upon his father's death. Contemporary accounts described him as a progressive planter, a man who believed in scientific agriculture and modern management techniques. He had installed one of the first steam-powered cotton gins in the region and had been written about in agricultural journals as an innovator in plantation efficiency. But Sarah knew that the language of progress and innovation in antebellum plantation management was simply a euphemism for finding more effective ways to extract labor from enslaved people. The more efficient the plantation, the more brutal the system required to maintain that efficiency. She found several letters written by Whitmore to other planters, correspondence preserved in various Southern historical societies, in which he discussed his management philosophy. The letters were filled with the cold, calculating language of someone who viewed human beings as agricultural equipment, discussing the optimal ratio of overseers to workers, the most effective punishment methods for maintaining discipline, and strategies for preventing escape attempts. Reading these letters made Sarah feel physically ill, but she forced herself to continue, knowing that understanding the oppressor was crucial to understanding the acts of resistance against him. Her research into the Whitmore family also revealed interesting details about the photograph itself. In a letter dated March 1852, Elizabeth Whitmore had written to her sister in Virginia describing the upcoming visit of an itinerant photographer who was traveling through Mississippi offering his services to plantation families. Elizabeth had been excited about the prospect of having a formal portrait made, seeing it as an opportunity to document the family's prosperity and status. The letter mentioned that Jonathan had initially been reluctant, viewing the expense as frivolous, but had eventually agreed after Elizabeth argued that such a portrait would serve as valuable documentation of their estate for future generations. The letter made no mention of the enslaved people who would be included in the photograph, treating their presence as such an unremarkable aspect of plantation life that it did not warrant comment. This omission itself spoke volumes about how normalized and invisible enslaved people had become in the worldview of slaveholders. Sarah made careful notes of everything she found, building a comprehensive timeline of events surrounding the creation of the photograph. She learned that the photographer, a man named Augustus Crane, had been one of several itinerant daguerreotypists working in the South during the early 1850s. Crane's business model involved traveling from plantation to plantation, setting up his equipment and offering portrait services to wealthy families. He had advertised his services in newspapers throughout Mississippi and Louisiana, promising high-quality images that would preserve family legacies for generations. Sarah managed to locate several other photographs taken by Crane during the same period, all following a similar compositional formula. Wealthy white families prominently displayed in the foreground, with plantation buildings and enslaved workers arranged in the background. But none of these other images showed the peculiar positioning and gestures that she had observed in the Oakwood Plantation photograph. This suggested that what had occurred at Oakwood was unique, a specific plan executed by specific individuals for specific reasons. The question that haunted Sarah was whether Crane himself had been aware of what was happening. Had the photographer noticed the unusual arrangement of the background figures and chosen to ignore it? Or had he been completely oblivious to the communication occurring right in front of his camera? Given the long exposure times required for daguerreotype photography, typically 30 seconds to several minutes depending on lighting conditions, the enslaved people in the photograph would have had to maintain their positions with absolute stillness. This meant their arrangement had been deliberate and carefully planned, not a spontaneous gesture captured by chance. Sarah spent hours examining other aspects of the photograph, noting every detail she could extract from the digital image. She observed that the 14 people in the background appeared to range in age from young children to elderly adults. Their clothing was typical of enslaved workers on a prosperous plantation, simple but relatively intact garments, suggesting that the Whitmores provided at least basic material support to maintain their workforce's productivity. But it was the expressions on the faces of these 14 people that truly captivated Sarah's attention. Unlike the stiff, formal expressions of the Whitmore family, who were clearly uncomfortable with the photographic process and struggling to maintain their poses, the enslaved people in the background showed a remarkable range of subtle emotions. One elderly woman, standing at the far left of the group, had an expression that Sarah could only describe as defiant, her chin raised slightly and her eyes focused directly toward the camera with an intensity that transcended the decades between the moment of exposure and Sarah's examination. A middle-aged man near the center of the group had a more careful expression, his face neutral but his eyes alert, as if watching for danger even as he participated in whatever plan was unfolding. The children in the photograph showed expressions of barely contained energy, the natural restlessness of youth momentarily frozen by the camera's gaze. Sarah realized that she was looking at real people, individuals with names and stories and hopes and fears, people who had been reduced to property in the legal and social systems of their time but who had found a way to assert their humanity and agency even in the most oppressive circumstances. This realization filled her with a profound sense of responsibility. She was not just investigating a historical curiosity or an interesting photographic anomaly. She was attempting to hear voices that had been systematically silenced, to honor the courage and intelligence of people who had risked everything to send a message that they could not have known would ever be received or understood. As Sarah continued her research, she began to focus on decoding the specific gestures and positions captured in the photograph. She consulted her extensive collection of research materials on Underground Railroad communication methods, including quilting patterns, song lyrics, and physical gestures that had been used to convey information about escape routes, safe houses, and dangers. Many of these communication systems had been documented after the Civil War by historians and by formerly enslaved people themselves, creating a fragmented but valuable record of resistance tactics. Sarah identified several gestures in the photograph that corresponded to documented Underground Railroad signals. The man with his hand positioned against his hip appeared to be making a sign that indicated a safe location or refuge. The woman with her raised hand seemed to be signaling a specific direction or pointing towards something beyond the frame of the photograph. Two of the children were positioned in a way that, when viewed in relation to the adults around them, created what appeared to be a map or directional guide. Sarah began sketching diagrams, tracing lines between the figures and noting the angles and relationships between their positions. A pattern emerged that suggested movement and direction, as if the arrangement of bodies in the photograph was encoding information about a route or journey. This discovery sent chills down Sarah's spine. She was looking at what might be a map of an escape route, hidden in plain sight in a photograph commissioned by the very people these enslaved workers were planning to escape from. The more Sarah analyzed the image, the more details she discovered. She noticed that several of the figures were wearing items of clothing or accessories that seemed significant. One man had a distinctive piece of cloth tied around his upper arm, its pattern and placement suggesting it might be a marker or identifier. A woman wore her head wrap in an elaborate style that differed from the simpler wraps worn by others in the group, perhaps indicating a leadership role or special status. Even the positioning of feet and the direction of gazes seemed deliberate, each element contributing to a complex visual communication that transcended the photographer's intention to document plantation property. Sarah spent an entire week immersed in this analysis, barely leaving her office except to teach her scheduled classes and grab quick meals. Her colleagues began to notice her obsessive focus, but she deflected their curious questions, not yet ready to share her findings until she had more concrete evidence. She knew that any claims about resistance and communication in slave photography would face intense scrutiny from other historians, particularly those who had built careers on more traditional interpretations of plantation imagery. She needed her documentation to be unassailable, her evidence comprehensive and convincing. During this period of intense research, Sarah also began investigating what had happened to Oakwood Plantation after 1852. Property records showed that the plantation had continued operating under Whitmore family ownership until 1863, when it had been seized by Union forces during the Civil War. The plantation house had been burned in 1864, reportedly by Confederate guerrillas who targeted properties occupied by Union troops. After the war, the property had been divided and sold off in parcels, with the land eventually transitioning from cotton cultivation to other agricultural uses. By the early 20th century, no trace remained of the original plantation complex, and the Whitmore family name had faded from prominence in Mississippi society. Sarah found this history both typical and tragic. Like so many plantations, Oakwood had been destroyed by the war that ended slavery, its physical structures reduced to ruins and eventually erased entirely from the landscape. But the photograph had survived, preserved through a chain of ownership that Sarah was still trying to trace. The daguerreotype had apparently remained in the possession of the Whitmore family descendants for generations before being sold to an antique dealer in the 1990s, who had eventually sold it to the South Carolina family whose estate donation had brought it to the Charleston Historical Society. This journey of the photograph itself was remarkable, a fragile artifact that had survived fires, wars, floods, and the simple passage of time to deliver its hidden message more than a century and a half after its creation. Sarah's breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks after she had first discovered the photograph. She had been working with a colleague in the anthropology department, Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in African American cultural practices and communication systems. Sarah had shown him the enhanced images and her preliminary analysis, and Marcus had immediately recognized something that she had missed. The positioning of the figures in the photograph corresponded not to Underground Railroad signals, as Sarah had initially theorized, but to something even more specific and remarkable. Marcus explained that the arrangement matched patterns used in certain West African communication systems that had been preserved and adapted by enslaved people in America. These systems involved using body positions, gestures, and spatial relationships to convey complex information, a form of embodied literacy that could bypass the prohibition against teaching enslaved people to read and write. The specific pattern in the Oakwood plantation photograph, Marcus suggested, was encoding information about multiple escape routes and a coordinated plan involving not just the 14 people visible in the image, but potentially many more individuals from the plantation. Sarah and Marcus spent hours examining the photograph together, with Marcus pointing out details and cultural significance that Sarah's extensive knowledge of photography and history had not prepared her to see. The elderly woman with the defiant expression, Marcus explained, was almost certainly the leader of the group, her positioning and body language indicating authority and decision-making power. The arrangement of the children was not random but deliberate, encoding specific information about timing and phases of an escape plan. Even the way certain individuals had positioned their feet, which Sarah had noted but not fully understood, conveyed information about which routes were safe and which were being watched by overseers or patrols. Marcus's expertise transformed Sarah's understanding of what she was looking at. This was not simply a hidden message or a subtle act of defiance. This photograph captured a moment of extraordinary coordination and planning, a conspiracy involving multiple people who had found a way to document their resistance and share their plans using the very technology of oppression that was meant to celebrate and perpetuate their enslavement. The implications were staggering. Sarah and Marcus immediately began collaborating on a comprehensive analysis, combining their respective expertise to decode every element of the photograph. They worked through weekends and late into numerous evenings, their excitement growing as more details revealed themselves. They discovered that the photograph contained at least 3 layers of encoded information, directional indicators showing routes to the north and west, temporal markers suggesting timing related to seasonal changes and river conditions, and identity markers that might have helped escapees identify themselves to contacts along the Underground Railroad network. As their analysis progressed, Sarah became increasingly determined to identify the 14 people in the photograph by name and to discover what had happened to them after this image was captured. This proved to be the most challenging aspect of her investigation. Records of enslaved people were notoriously incomplete and unreliable. Slaveholders generally kept minimal documentation of the individuals they enslaved, often recording only first names, ages, and monetary values in estate inventories or bills of sale. Personal details, family relationships, and individual histories were rarely documented, reflecting the slaveholders' refusal to acknowledge the full humanity of the people they oppressed. However, Sarah had experience working with fragmentary historical sources, and she approached this challenge with determination and methodical care. She began by cross-referencing the Oakwood plantation records with census data from 1850 and 1860, looking for any mention of enslaved people whose ages and descriptions might match the individuals in the photograph. She found estate inventories from Jonathan Whitmore's property records that listed the names and ages of enslaved people at Oakwood during the relevant period. The inventory from 1851 listed 168 enslaved people, including their approximate ages and assigned work duties. Sarah began the painstaking process of matching these names to the faces in the photograph, using age estimates, physical descriptions where available, and the positions and apparent roles of individuals in the image. After weeks of careful analysis and cross-referencing, Sarah tentatively identified several of the people in the photograph. The elderly woman who had first captured her attention was likely named Harriet, listed in the estate inventory as 63 years old in 1851 and noted as working in the plantation house. The middle-aged man appeared to be Samuel, age 41, listed as a skilled carpenter and blacksmith. Two of the children matched the descriptions of siblings named Ruth and Isaac, ages 8 and 10 respectively, children of a woman named Dinah who was also visible in the photograph. As Sarah built this list of names and identities, the photograph transformed from an anonymous historical artifact into a portrait of real people with documented lives and relationships. But the most important question remained: what had happened to these 14 people? Had they succeeded in escaping, or had their plan been discovered? Sarah searched through newspapers from Mississippi and surrounding states, looking for notices about runaway slaves or reports of captured escapees from Oakwood Plantation. These notices were common in antebellum newspapers, providing detailed descriptions of people who had escaped and offering rewards for their capture and return. Sarah found several such notices related to Oakwood Plantation from the 1850s, including one from October 1852 that described the disappearance of multiple enslaved people from the property. The notice, placed by Jonathan Whitmore and published in newspapers throughout Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee, described a group of 17 people who had vanished from Oakwood Plantation on the night of October 15, 1852, approximately 7 months after the photograph was taken. The description included names that matched several of the individuals Sarah had identified in the photograph, including Harriet, Samuel, Ruth, and Isaac. The notice offered a substantial reward of $2,000 for information leading to the capture and return of the escapees, an enormous sum that indicated both the financial value Whitmore placed on these individuals and his fury at their escape. The notice described the escapees as dangerous and potentially armed, language designed to justify violence against them if they were encountered. Reading this notice, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that these people had attempted their escape, anxiety about whether they had succeeded in reaching freedom, and anger at the dehumanizing language used to describe them. She continued searching for any follow-up reports about whether the escapees had been captured or whether they had successfully reached free territory. The search proved frustrating, as many historical records from this period were incomplete or had been lost over time. However, Sarah eventually found a crucial piece of evidence in an unexpected location. The archives of the American Missionary Association contained correspondence from a Quaker abolitionist named Eleanor Richardson, who had operated a station on the Underground Railroad in southern Ohio during the 1850s. In a letter dated December 1852, Richardson described providing assistance to a group of 17 people who had arrived at her station after an arduous journey from Mississippi. The letter included details that matched the Oakwood Plantation escapees, including the presence of an elderly woman who served as the group's leader and a skilled carpenter who had helped construct hiding places and river crossings during their journey. Richardson's letter described these 17 people as remarkably organized and determined, noting that they had arrived with clear plans and expectations about the next stages of their journey north. This detail resonated powerfully with Sarah's analysis of the photograph. These people had not simply fled on impulse or individual initiative. They had planned their escape meticulously, coordinating their efforts and encoding their plans in a photograph that would serve as both documentation and communication tool. The photograph itself might have been shown to Underground Railroad contacts, providing visual confirmation of identities and plans. Sarah continued tracing the journey of the Oakwood escapees through various archival sources, piecing together fragments of their story from abolitionist correspondence, Underground Railroad records, and census data from northern states. She found references to a family matching the description of Dinah and her children, Ruth and Isaac, living in Cleveland, Ohio by 1855. She found a man named Samuel working as a skilled craftsman in Detroit, Michigan in 1860. Most remarkably, she found an obituary from 1881 for a woman named Harriet Robinson, formerly enslaved in Mississippi, who had spent her later years working with freed people and advocating for civil rights. The obituary described her as a hero of the Underground Railroad who had led 17 people to freedom in 1852. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she read this obituary, overwhelmed by the realization that Harriet, the elderly woman whose defiant expression had first captured her attention in the photograph, had not only escaped but had lived for nearly 3 more decades in freedom, continuing her work of resistance and liberation. The story of these 17 people, and particularly the 14 captured in the photograph, became the center of Sarah's research and writing. She documented every detail she had discovered, building a comprehensive narrative that wove together photographic analysis, historical records, and cultural interpretation. But Sarah also knew that her academic work was not enough. She felt a responsibility to share this story more broadly, to ensure that Harriet, Samuel, Dinah, Ruth, Isaac, and all the others whose names she had worked so hard to recover would be remembered and honored. She began working on a public exhibition that would display the photograph alongside her research, allowing visitors to see both the image itself and the story it contained. She contacted descendants of the Oakwood escapees, several of whom she had located through genealogical research, and invited them to participate in the project. Many of these descendants had known little about their ancestors' experiences of slavery and escape, and Sarah's research provided them with a connection to their family history that had been lost or deliberately obscured over generations. The project grew beyond Sarah's initial vision, becoming a collaborative effort that involved historians, descendants, artists, and community members. A sculptor created a memorial depicting the 17 escapees, using Sarah's research and the photograph as the basis for individual portraits. Writers worked with descendant families to collect oral histories and family traditions that complemented the archival evidence. By the spring of 2025, Sarah's research had developed into a major exhibition at the Charleston Historical Society titled Hidden Messages: Resistance and Communication in Slavery Photography. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the Oakwood plantation photograph, displayed in a specially designed case with enhanced digital versions that allowed visitors to explore the image's details through interactive touchscreens. Accompanying panels told the story of Harriet, Samuel, and the other escapees, documenting their journey from Mississippi to freedom and tracing their lives after escape. The exhibition included contextual information about plantation photography, Underground Railroad communication systems, and the broader history of resistance to slavery. Sarah had also worked with Marcus Webb and other colleagues to include material about African cultural practices that had been preserved and adapted by enslaved people in America, showing how the patterns visible in the photograph connected to much older traditions of embodied communication and community organization. The exhibition opening drew significant media attention and large crowds. Descendants of the Oakwood escapees attended, many meeting each other for the first time and discovering unexpected family connections. The event became a powerful moment of recognition and healing, as people confronted the difficult history of slavery while also celebrating the courage and ingenuity of those who had resisted and ultimately escaped its bonds. For Sarah, the exhibition represented the culmination of months of intensive research, but it also marked the beginning of new questions and investigations. The Oakwood plantation photograph was unique, but Sarah now believed it was unlikely to be completely singular. How many other photographs from the slavery era contained hidden messages or acts of resistance that had gone unnoticed by generations of historians? Sarah began expanding her research, examining hundreds of plantation photographs with new eyes, looking for patterns and anomalies that might reveal similar acts of communication and defiance. She trained a team of graduate students in the analytical methods she had developed, creating a systematic approach to studying slave photography for evidence of resistance. This work attracted funding from major foundations interested in supporting innovative historical research, and Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement to re-examine American slavery through the lens of resistance and agency rather than simply victimization and oppression. The academic response to Sarah's work was largely positive, though not without controversy. Some historians questioned her interpretations, arguing that she was reading too much into ambiguous evidence and projecting modern desires for resistance narratives onto historical images. Sarah engaged these critiques seriously, acknowledging the limitations of her evidence while also defending the validity of her methods and conclusions. She pointed out that the historical record was overwhelmingly biased toward the perspectives of slaveholders and that recovering the voices and actions of enslaved people required new approaches and willingness to look beyond traditional sources. One of the most significant developments following the exhibition was the establishment of the Harriet Robinson Research Initiative, a program dedicated to identifying and documenting acts of resistance by enslaved people throughout American history. The initiative was funded through a combination of grants, donations, and university support, and it brought together scholars from multiple disciplines to collaborate on recovering hidden histories. Sarah served as the director of the initiative, coordinating research projects and mentoring younger scholars who were passionate about this work. The initiative also developed partnerships with community organizations and historically Black colleges and universities, ensuring that the research would benefit and involve the communities most directly connected to this history. Sarah found particular satisfaction in working with descendant families, helping people connect with their ancestors' stories and claim family histories that had been deliberately obscured or forgotten. She traveled to communities throughout the South and Midwest, giving presentations about her research and encouraging people to search their own family histories for evidence of resistance and survival. Many people discovered that their ancestors had participated in underground railroad networks or had engaged in various forms of resistance that had never been formally documented but had been preserved through oral traditions and family stories. These connections between academic research and lived experience became central to Sarah's understanding of her work's purpose and meaning. The Oakwood Plantation photograph itself became famous beyond academic and historical circles, reproduced in textbooks, documentaries, and popular articles about slavery and resistance. The image of Harriet, standing defiant in the background while the Whitmore family posed obliviously in the foreground, became iconic, a visual representation of the hidden agency and resistance that had always existed within the slave system. For many people, the photograph challenged simplistic narratives about slavery that focused primarily on brutality and victimization without adequately acknowledging the intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking of enslaved people themselves. The photograph reminded viewers that enslaved people were not passive victims but rather active agents who constantly sought ways to resist, subvert, and ultimately escape the systems that oppressed them. This shift in perspective had important implications for how Americans understood their history and grappled with the ongoing legacy of slavery and racism. Sarah frequently received messages from teachers, students, and general readers who described how the photograph had changed their understanding of American history and inspired them to learn more about resistance and survival during slavery. As the first anniversary of the exhibition approached, Sarah reflected on how the Oakwood Plantation photograph had transformed her own life and career. The discovery had brought her international recognition, numerous speaking invitations, and opportunities she had never anticipated. More importantly, it had deepened her sense of purpose and commitment to her work. She had always believed that history mattered, that understanding the past was essential for confronting present injustices and building a better future. But her work with this photograph had made that belief more concrete and personal. She had connected with real people, both the ancestors whose stories she had recovered and the descendants who carried forward their legacy. She had helped restore names, faces, and narratives to people who had been deliberately erased from historical memory. This work felt sacred to Sarah, a responsibility she carried with both humility and determination. She also recognized that her work was far from complete. The Oakwood plantation photograph had revealed just how much remained hidden in plain sight throughout American historical records. Every archive likely contains similar evidence, waiting for someone to look closely enough, think creatively enough, and care deeply enough to uncover it. Sarah committed herself to continuing this work for as long as she was able, training the next generation of historians and ensuring that the project of recovering hidden voices and untold stories would continue long after her own career ended. The photograph also sparked broader conversations about memory, representation, and historical justice. Artists created works inspired by the image, exploring themes of visibility and invisibility, resistance and oppression, documentation and erasure. Playwrights wrote dramatic interpretations of the escapee's story, imagining the conversations and decisions that must have occurred in the days and weeks before their flight to freedom. Filmmakers expressed interest in developing documentary and narrative projects based on Sarah's research. All of these creative responses testified to the power of the photograph to inspire and provoke, to make people think differently about familiar aspects of American history. Sarah participated in many of these projects, serving as a consultant and advocate for accurate, respectful representation of the people whose story was being told. She insisted that any creative interpretation must honor the historical reality of slavery's brutality while also celebrating the resistance and humanity of enslaved people. This balance was not always easy to achieve, but Sarah believed it was essential to avoiding both sanitized versions of history that minimized slavery's violence and reductive narratives that portrayed enslaved people only as victims. In her personal life, Sarah found that her work with the photograph had changed her in unexpected ways. She had always been passionate about her research, but this project had touched something deeper, connecting her not just intellectually but emotionally and spiritually to the past. She began volunteering with organizations working on contemporary issues of racial justice, seeing clear connections between historical struggles and present-day challenges. She participated in efforts to reform how history was taught in public schools, advocating for curricula that centered the experiences and perspectives of enslaved people and other marginalized groups. She spoke at community forums about Confederate monuments and historical memory, arguing that understanding the full complexity of American history required confronting uncomfortable truths and honoring all the people who had lived through and resisted oppression. These activities sometimes generated controversy and criticism, but Sarah remained committed to them, believing that historians had a responsibility to engage with public debates about memory and justice. The photograph had taught her that historical evidence could be both beautiful and devastating, that a single image could contain layers of meaning that transformed understanding, and that the past was never really past but rather continued to shape the present in profound ways. As Sarah continued her work in the months and years following the exhibition, she often returned to the original photograph, sitting quietly in the archives and studying the image that had launched her on this journey. Each time she looked at it, she noticed new details, found new questions, and felt renewed connection to the 14 people whose faces gazed out from the daguerreotype surface. She thought about Harriet, the elderly woman whose courage and leadership had made the escape possible, and wondered what thoughts had gone through her mind as she stood there on that day in 1852, maintaining her pose for the photographer while simultaneously encoding a message that would take 172 years to fully decode. She thought about the children, Ruth and Isaac, and imagined their terror and excitement as they embarked on a journey toward an uncertain future, trusting in the adults around them and in the plan that had been so carefully laid. She thought about Samuel, using his skills and intelligence to help construct the physical means of escape, building ladders and rafts and hiding places that would carry his community toward freedom. All of these people had lived full lives that extended far beyond the moment captured in the photograph, and Sarah felt grateful that her research had helped recover some of their stories and restore some of their dignity and recognition. The work also reminded Sarah of the countless other people whose stories remained hidden, whose acts of resistance had left no visible trace in the historical record, whose names and faces and struggles had been lost to time and erasure. For every Harriet Robinson whose obituary had survived, How many others had lived and died in obscurity, their courage and sacrifices known only to themselves and their immediate community? This question haunted Sarah, driving her to continue searching for evidence and encouraging others to join in the work of recovery and recognition. She knew that perfect historical knowledge was impossible, that many stories would remain forever beyond reach. But she also believed that every story recovered, every name restored, every act of resistance documented represented a victory against the forces of erasure and forgetting. The Oakwood plantation photograph had proven that with careful attention, innovative methods, and deep commitment, historians could recover voices that had been silenced and bring to light truths that had been hidden. This realization filled Sarah with hope and determination, sustaining her through the difficult work of confronting historical trauma and injustice. On a gray afternoon in November 2025, exactly 1 year after she had first discovered the photograph, Sarah stood before the exhibition one final time before it closed to prepare for travel to other museums and cultural institutions. She looked at the image of Harriet, still defiant after all these years, and silently promised to continue the work of honoring her legacy and the legacies of all those who had resisted slavery. The photograph that had looked so ordinary at first glance had revealed extraordinary courage, intelligence, and hope. It had shown Sarah that resistance could take many forms, that communication could transcend the boundaries imposed by oppression, and that human dignity could never be completely erased no matter how brutal the systems designed to crush it. As she walked out of the archives that afternoon, Sarah carried with her the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose, knowing that her work mattered, that the past was still speaking to those who knew how to listen, and that a single photograph from 1852 had the power to change how millions of people understood American history and the ongoing struggle for justice and recognition. The secret hidden in the background of that plantation photograph had finally been revealed, and its message of resistance and hope would continue to resonate for generations to come.